Douglas A. Tracy, agent with Standard Insurance Company.
Welcome to the City Club of Portland, Oregon's most respected public forum. The City Club was founded in 1915 as a civic research organization. Today, its members are 2,000 men and women who share a common interest in the quality of life and government in the Portland metropolitan community. The City Club meets on Fridays at noon in downtown Portland to present speakers selected for their distinction in specialized fields, their knowledge of specific issues, and the freshness and vitality of their ideas. This week's speakers are Mary Lou Calvin, Vernon L. Bates, and Edward M. Colbach, speaking on violence in our community. Can we afford to ignore it? And now, the club's presiding officer will introduce today's speaker.
Management consultant James Townsend, who will discuss profile. And now for today's subject. Every community in the nation is experiencing a rise in crime. Most disturbing is the occurrence of violent stranger-to-stranger crime for which no explanation seems easily available. Studies of criminal behavior indicate an alarming trend whose roots lie in domestic violence. Dr. Carl Menninger noted before the City Club last month that most of today's criminals are the products of violence at home. A survey at San Quentin Federal Prison found that 100% of the inmates had been raised in violent home atmospheres. Experts estimate that violent episodes occur in 50% of all American homes. 25% of all homicides are in the family. 60% of all assaults occur between people who know each other. Intervention in domestic violence cases is the second most dangerous situation faced by the police. In short, the statistics indicate that violence at home is more than a personal problem. It is, in fact, a very grave community problem. And that is the question before us today. Can we afford to ignore it? We have three panelists with us today to discuss that subject. Those panelists were selected for their expertise in the fields of criminal justice, sociology, and psychiatry. They were chosen by the City Club Standing Committee on Law and Public Safety. I'd like to introduce them all at this time. Please hold your applause until the end. Seated at my far left, the head table, is Dr. Edward Colbach, a graduate of Northwestern University Medical School. Dr. Colbach served his psychiatric residency at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka. He is now in private practice in Portland and is certified in both general and forensic psychiatry. He has been a consultant to the Multnomah County Department of Public Safety and to various courts in the Portland area. He was an associate member of Governor Straub's Task Force on Corrections in 1976-1977. Seated on his right is Mary Lou Calvin, who will moderate today's discussion. For the past 7 years, Mary Lou has worked in the criminal justice system both for the city and for the county. Between 1973 and 75, she developed for the Multnomah County District Attorney the nationally recognized Rape Victim Advocate Program and the Victims Assistance Program. Since 1978, she has directed the Office of Justice Planning and Evaluation for the City of Portland under Commissioner Charles Jordan. This commission provides policy analysis, program planning, and program evaluation services for the city for criminal justice matters. In 1979, she worked to develop the joint city-county family violence project. Our third panelist, seated to my immediate left, is Dr. Vernon Bates, assistant professor of sociology at Pacific University. Dr. Bates received his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Oregon in 1969 and his doctorate in sociology from the University of California at Davis, 1976. With a faculty internship grant from the Lilly Foundation in 1978, he worked with the Portland Police Bureau to evaluate police officer response to mandatory arrests of assailants in domestic violence cases. His paper, Police Response to Domestic Violence, was presented last spring in San Francisco. Please welcome our three panelists. This time I would like to turn the meeting over to Mary Lou Calvin. There will be some brief comments from each of the panel members, and then we will have questions between the panel members and questions from the audience. Mary Lou.
Thank you. I guess the first thing I should tell you is that when we saw that the title had been changed to Violence in Our Community, we've taken a little liberty with what we're going to do with it. We will still talk about family violence, but we want to draw the thread to other violence as well. When Vernon, Ed, and I got together to talk about what material we might share with you today and what wisdom we might be able to bring to the City Club, we said, well, let's first of all start off with a disclaimer. Let's first of all tell them that if they came looking for any answers or any single solutions to the problem of violence in Portland or anywhere else, we don't have them. None of us individually has discovered a miraculous cure for violence. We're all spending a great deal of our professional life trying to find out what the dynamics of violence are, and it's much like solving a dread disease. You look at the symptoms first, and eventually maybe you come up with some of the solutions. Ed is a psychiatrist, as you've heard. Vern is a sociologist. I'm a political scientist by education, criminal justice professional, I guess, by work. Each of us has developed, I think, some theories and some beliefs about violence. Because of our backgrounds and because of the people we read and the research we study, we've come up with some fairly different, I think, explanations. Don't expect us to be uniform. I think the discussion will be as lively at this table as it will be between all of us when the program is over. I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting today to get you in the mood to talk about violence, and then I will act as moderator and ask some questions of my colleagues. I tried this on my 16-year-old son last night, and I got halfway through and he said, "Mom, please stop." So I don't, if it gets real bad, stop me, but I'd like to finish. I'd like to share some actual cases and some cases that I think I could classify as typical of violence to reflect the kind of problem we have in our community and in other communities. A 59-year-old woman is brutally murdered in her home by two young men who have chosen her as their next robbery victim because she seems easy. She is beaten to death with a golf club and a chair as she pleads for her life. An elderly woman is tied to her bed and left with a loaf of bread for the weekend while her granddaughter's family goes camping. A young mother of 25, pregnant with her third child, is repeatedly punched in the stomach during a quarrel with her unemployed husband. A young Indo-Chinese student is attacked on the bus on the way to school by several of his schoolmates and is hit and kicked until he loses several of his teeth. A 5-month-old baby suffers second-degree burns over much of his body when his mother gives him a bath to clean him after diapering him. A young man in his late 20s is leaving his restaurant job in downtown Portland when he is attacked and brutally beaten by several high school students who use 2x4s and brass knuckles to take care of homosexuals. A young teacher is raped in her classroom at 7:30 in the morning in one of our elementary schools. Two children, brothers, whose fighting usually only involves words and fists, somehow involve a gun in their latest quarrel. One of them is killed. At a hearing in a local courtroom, an irate husband, upset about his wife's divorce suit, pulls a gun and fires it at her, killing her attorney instead. He then turns the gun on himself. Someone pours gasoline in the stairwell of an Old Town hotel, which houses pensioners and other Skid Row residents. 13 die. You lasted. I could go on and on. You read the papers, I read the papers. We know that these are the facts of life in America. But how do we integrate these events into our view of the world? Do we read them and accept them and say, well, that's one of the prices of living in urban America? If so, how do these incidents of violence compare with other communities in our country? Take the crime of murder. There were 48 murders in Portland in 1980, an increase of 20% from the year before. In 1979, the murder rate in Portland was approximately 10.8 per 100,000 persons, compared to a national average of 9.7 per 100,000. Other urban areas experienced a homicide rate of 11 per 100,000, so that makes Portland just about average as a city where murder is committed. We're not average, however, when the 1979 statistics reveal that 40% of the homicides in Portland were within families. That's compared to a 20% average nationwide. Abuse of the elderly, an impossible crime of violence to count, is estimated to occur in the lives of from 500,000 to 1 million elderly people over 65 every year in this country. Spouse abuse, the crime I illustrated with the young pregnant woman being punched in the stomach, occurs with alarming frequency in Portland. In 1980, Portland police responded to 4,664 family disturbance calls. Even then, we believe many incidents go unreported. It has been estimated that in 1975, 4 million men and women physically harmed their spouses. Acts of violence against minorities and against our newest citizens, the refugees, are occurring with a greater frequency than we read about in the newspapers. Many of these victims do not report acts of violence against them to the police because they're afraid to do so. How do we measure up as a community when we examine the number of child abuse and neglect reports? In 1979, Children's Protective Services, the Oregon agency which works with reported child abuse, reported that in Multnomah County alone, there were 701 substantiated cases of child abuse and neglect. This is an increase of 246% over the 284 cases in 1977. When digesting this particular statistic, tuck away the fact that only 1 in 5 child abuse cases is believed to be reported to the authorities. How about the practice of gay bashing? How common is this problem in Portland? A recent article in the Oregonian discussed the issue, and while the reporting of such incidents is believed to be very low, and assaults are not categorized by the police according to sexual preference of the victims, most law enforcement officials believe the crime is increasing, and members of the gay community know it is. A preliminary and superficial examination of rape statistics for Portland would have us believe that we live in the rape capital of the world. In 1979, there were 435 reported rapes in Portland. That's 117.5 per 100,000 population, compared to 34.5 nationally. And that 100,000 counts men and women, and rape is a crime that only occurs against women. The rate of reporting is an important factor when we're considering any of these crimes. It's especially important in rape. Probably homicide is the only crime we believe we get fairly accurate statistics on. And the only explanation I can come up with for the high rate of reported rape is that we have a higher than average reporting rate. Efforts over the last 7 or 8 years of local law enforcement agencies to respond to the special problems of rape victims have, I believe, taken some of the stigma out of reporting rape. I believe that the victim of rape in Portland doesn't feel that she's going to be further traumatized by her community and by the criminal justice process. The example of sibling violence that I used, the 2 brothers fighting, is typical of the kind of violence that we'll read about that'll be termed accidental death in our newspapers. Kids will be kids, they say, and that means that kids will fight with their brothers and sisters and accidents will happen. If there's being a mother of 3, if there's a most common form of family violence, this one gets my vote. According to the Book of State Comparisons, published in 1979, Oregon ranks 10th in suicides nationwide, 9th in the total crime index, 13th in the violent crime index, 12th in aggravated assault, 7th in forcible rape, and 17th in the number of persons in our institutions, including hospitals, mental hospitals, and prisons. Finally, we rank 25th in the frequency of persons killed by handguns. These statistics were gathered from federal agencies across the country during the last half of the 70s and are based, as are most crime statistics, on incidents per 100,000 individuals. Well, those statistics have painted a picture of violence that may be bloodier than you expected, larger than you expected, and those of us who work in the area find it much more complicated than we would like. As residents of Portland, we pay a very dear price for violence, and among the true costs of violence, I'd like to have us look at 3. First, violence in our community is costly, in dollars and cents. Our police bureau budget runs about $27 million a year. Multnomah County, in the next fiscal year, will spend about $36 million on its criminal justice agencies. Not all of these expenditures, of course, are related to violence, but many of them are. The cost of a police investigation of a domestic disturbance call is estimated to be from $27 to $45 per police car. The cost, using those figures then, for a 1-month response to family violence in Portland can run as high as $36,000. The cost to defend an indigent person accused of murder has been estimated at $10,000. The cost of prosecuting him is probably higher. The average cost of a visit to an emergency room in a Portland hospital is $60.30. The estimated number of visits for family violence alone in May of 1980 was estimated at 286. The total estimated cost then for 1 month of emergency room care for victims of family violence was $17,245. There are many economic costs of violence in the community. You can think of some that I haven't listed. But there are also costs that we can count in human terms that have, I think, a greater impact. One of these human costs is fear. How free are we as a people if we are afraid to use our parks, walk in our neighborhoods, go downtown at night, or shop in a different part of town? How do we measure the impact of that fear on our lives? Only you can answer that, but I'd like to ask you some questions that might help you focus on it. When was the last time you really wanted to go for a walk in the neighborhood after dinner, but you were afraid to? When was the last time you really wanted to pick up that young man walking in the rain with a gas can in his hand, but you were afraid to? When was the last time your wife or daughter went out alone at night and you worried till they came home? And if you're a woman, when was the last time you walked alone on a downtown street at night without constantly looking over your shoulder? How many of you own a big dog and you don't even like dogs? In short, how many of the activities of your life have you curtailed because you no longer feel safe doing them? That's a cost of violence. The third cost, I played around with this. I was going to tell you it was a dividend in a way on an investment. If we invest in violence, we will reap dividends, but it's actually a cost to society. Violence breeds violence. People learn violent behavior. They pass it on to their children. They carry it from generation to generation. For example, studies indicate that 85% of the children who are raised in violent homes will become violent adults. In a New York study, it was revealed that 50% of the families reported at one time or another for child abuse later showed up because they had a child who was ungovernable or delinquent. In one New York county, 65% of these families were in this situation. You heard some other statistics from our president, and I won't go into them because some of them were mine. My colleagues are prepared to discuss violence from their perspectives now, and I'd like them to address themselves to explaining some of the phenomena I've kind of shared with you. I get to do the easy part. I describe it, they explain it, right? To start, Vern Bates is a professor of sociology at Pacific University, and one of the courses he teaches is sociology of the family. Vern, you're familiar with the dynamics of family violence. Can you tell the audience something about violence in the family?
One of the things that I would like to say is I'm not going to present a picture that is any more pleasant than the picture that Mary Lou has presented. The ideal picture that we would like to have of the family is a tightly knit unit that's a source of love for all of us, a source of sympathy, a source of understanding, a source of unlimited support. And to a large extent, I think that is probably true in this country today. But at the same time, data that has been collected by sociologists gives us another picture that is somewhat disturbing. In the United States, throughout the 70s, yearly, we can expect that there will be about 6 million incidents of serious physical abuse within the family. In a study by Richard Gellis and Murray Strauss, they concluded that a person in this society is more likely to be hit or killed at home by a family member than anywhere else or by anyone else. And FBI Uniform Crime Report statistics support that contention. 1 out of every 4 murders in this society is familial. And half of those are spouses who are murdered. In another study by Richard Gellis, where he interviewed 80 families, did some in-depth interviews with 80 families, he discovered that over the lifespan of the couple's marriage, over half of them had used physical violence. And physical violence is described by them as pushing, shoving, kicking, grabbing, all the way up to stabbing and threatening to stab, threatening to shoot, and shooting. Of these 80 couples that Gellis interviewed, 26% of them use physical violence regularly to solve what they conceive to be their problems. And that regularly means from 6 times a year to daily. So there are some people out there somewhere who are being beaten by their spouse on a daily basis. In another study by Susan Steinmetz with Richard Gellis and Murray Strauss, a survey of 2,143 families, or persons, excuse me, half of them women, half of them men. They concluded that 16% of them used some kind of physical force in their family relations. One of the kinds of conclusions that they reached was that abuse is done as often by females as it is by males. One of the stereotypical pictures that we have is that abuse is done primarily by males. And there was a storm of protest when those figures first came out. And in response to this notion that women were as abusive as men, Strauss, Steinmetz, and Gellis looked at their data a little more carefully and discovered that most of the women who were engaging in physical violence were being defensive. The violence that was perpetrated by them was in response to, oftentimes, to beatings suffered under the hands of their husband day after day, year after year. And they finally get fed up, and you've heard cases where women try to blow their husbands up in bed, hire killers to get rid of them, on and on. A broader question is who does these sorts of things? Where can we locate family violence in the socioeconomic structure of the society? Well, sociologists have concluded that family violence occurs at every level in the society. It occurs at the very top and at the very bottom. There are some trends that they can point to where violence is more likely to occur, and I'll give you some of those figures in a minute, but I want to emphasize that family violence could be occurring next door. It can occur in any family. One of the points I would like to make is that people who perpetrate family violence are not psychopaths. At least that's the conclusion of Steinmetz and Strauss. They are not disturbed personalities. They are people who are subject to certain kinds of tensions, certain social conditions. They have learned violence as a response and use that to solve their problems, but they are not necessarily disturbed personalities. Here are some of the figures. The highest incidence of family violence occurs among these groups: people who live in urban settings, people who have from 4 to 6 children, people who have some high school, people who come from low-income families, people who come from blue-collar families, people who are under 30, people who belong to racial minority groups, and people who are unemployed. Now again, that is perhaps perpetuates this notion, this myth, that all family violence occurs in the lower segments of the society. To some extent that is true, but it is not overwhelmingly true. There's a trend in that direction, but family violence does occur at all levels. The families where there is the lowest amount of violence are those families that sociologists call egalitarian families, or families where the decision-making process is shared equally by husbands and wives. The victims of family violence, if we evaluate what happens to the victims, we have discovered that women, and this probably sounds logical, are the most likely to get the worst end of it, simply because men are bigger. And one of the kinds of things that the Portland police will tell you, and virtually any police officer across the United States, some of these women who get the worst end of it remain with their mates who continue to abuse them. And sometimes people blame them and say, well, they deserve it because they stick around. They don't get out of that setting. But at the same time, you have to recognize that many of these women are socially and economically trapped in that setting, and they have very few other alternatives. That is their support system. And even if it is not a very good support system, it's better than being out on the streets without a job. Okay.
Thank you, Vern. I wanted you to answer a question for the audience today that deals to some extent with Portland's response, or any community's response. What can a community do about family violence? What are we doing in Portland? What aren't we doing that we could do?
Okay. Mary Lou brought some brochures, and I don't know if they've been distributed. It gives the names of some of the agents, if they have some interest in this area or have that they wish to report. Those alternatives in Portland that I am most familiar with are the shelter homes, where women who have been abused can go to escape their husbands. Generally, the location of these places are hidden. They are not open to the public, so the males, generally males, can find them. In Oregon, House Bill 2438 has been passed, which is a mandatory custody law, and that mandatory custody law essentially requires that police officers arrest an abuser at the scene of the abuse without asking for the consent of the spouse. If they come on the scene, discover that there is reason to arrest a person, they don't ask the wife, should I take this man away? They are required to take the abuser away. Some people have viewed that as a positive outcome. Police officers generally do not like it. They would rather have more freedom than having that freedom taken away. Across the United States, there are increasingly victims assistance programs where victims can find someone who will help them through the court system, help them to find some social services, those kinds of things. And also, there are some states, I don't believe we have it in Oregon yet, where there are judges set mandatory counseling for abusers. In other words, instead of just sending them to jail, instead of giving them a jail sentence, they require that they go through some kind of psychological or psychiatric treatment.
Thank you. Ed and I have been on programs before, and I know how to get right to the issue with Ed, and I want him to talk about violence today. But before we start, Ed, you always talk about psychological violence and how that pervades our lives. Could you start there today?
Well, just briefly, when someone asked me to be on this program and talk about violence in our community, I said, do you mean psychological or physical? And what I meant as a psychiatrist is that I think all of us here in this room probably are guilty of some ongoing psychological violence, which I would term as maybe being inattentive to a spouse, not paying enough attention to a child, maybe being a little bit insensitive with employees or bosses or that sort of thing. And I don't think we pay enough attention to it. So we're not just talking about people who go out and thump others. We're talking about people who psychologically abuse others, and I don't think the two are unrelated, because the theme you've heard here, if you psychologically abuse others enough, especially in the family, somebody's going to become physically abusive. I just think we need to think about that.
Thank you. If you could take the violent characteristics of most of the people who commit violence upon one another in our community and put them into a composite human being, what would the composite violent man or woman look like?
One of the things I've done in the Portland area in the last 10 years or so is I've evaluated a lot of people who are in the criminal justice system for one reason or other. And for this presentation, I just reviewed about 50 to 75 cases that I could put my hands on of people who had either killed others or come very close to killing others. Maybe they shot somebody in the heart, but the bullet didn't penetrate because a badge reflected it or deflected it or something of that nature. And I thought I'd just try to give you a quick composite of the kind of people in Portland who are really committing some violent assaults on others. And I tried to come up with a brief summary. If I could say one thing about this group, it would be this. These are people who, the way they see the world, do not have much to lose. What do I mean by that? I'm not just talking about they don't have much to lose in terms of a house and a car and a bank account. I'm trying to be much more subtle and broad. I think they view the world as a place that doesn't care about them, that nobody really cares about them. They feel very unloved, they feel very bad about themselves, and they really just don't give a darn. Now this afternoon, if someone offends me and gets me so mad I'd like to kill them, I hope I don't do it. And I won't do it for a variety of reasons. I don't want to lose my reputation, my family. Part of my ethic is you don't hit people when you're mad, you try to talk it out. I want to lose my medical license. But this group has not got things like that to lose. So they don't care. If they are frustrated or unhappy, why not let it all hang out? Show it physically. So I think in my personal affairs, the group of people I'm most afraid of are anyone that I define as not having anything to lose. If someone offends me and I put them in this category, I'll let the offense pass. I'm not going to be very assertive. I don't want to be someone else's, another notch in somebody's belt or gun. Now quickly, the composite of the group that I've seen, if we take, say, 75 cases of people in the Portland area in the last 3 to 4 years who have really hurt other people, it's primarily a male group, primarily a young group. And that's about one of the greatest hopes I can hold out for the future. We're talking about a group below the age of 30. They tell me that our population is aging. It may bankrupt the Social Security system, but perhaps violence will diminish as our population grows older. This is a group that is either unmarried or has a marriage that's not doing well. It's a group that usually hasn't finished high school, not because they're stupid, but just because they cannot cope with the structure of a high school. Often have been in the military and have lasted 3 months. Say, why'd you get out? I don't know, I just wasn't doing well, so they kicked me out. In terms of the crime, we're talking about violent activity against others. Some of them happen with a robbery, a bank robbery or something of that nature, but many of them just seems senseless. In asking people, why did you hurt this person? So often you get, I don't know. And when you talk to this person more, you get a feeling that this is a very angry person, and as I said, he perceives the world, he doesn't have much to lose, he's angry, frustrated, so he just strikes out at someone else. Probably of these violent activities, maybe a third involve guns. Another big proportion involves automobiles. Just think of an automobile, it's a weapon. Either when you have alcohol or when you're very frustrated and angry and you just floor the car. And the others go from everything to taking a hatchet to your girlfriend to strangling someone, or using a rope to do that, or your hands. So there's a wide variety of ways in which people attack others when they're angry. They'll say, well, he insulted my girlfriend, or I didn't like the way he looks. Or in the more bizarre people, he was calling me a homosexual under his breath, or God told me to strike at this individual. Alcohol is involved a lot. Early in the 70s, I saw drugs like LSD and marijuana involved more often. I don't see much of that now. I see mostly alcohol again. We've gone through that phase. I'd say probably in half these cases, alcohol is involved to some extent. When you do a family background on these people, you've heard it today, it's always chaotic. No one came to mind in my study, maybe one or two families, but these were strange situations where an old man became senile. But in almost all cases, there's a terrible family background, a broken home, or if they stayed together, there was a chaotic home where there's a lot of fighting going on, a lot of alcohol. You see a lot of alcohol in the families. And this is, you so often see that this sort of violent activity does run in generation after generation. I don't know who watched East of Eden this week. I didn't think it was the greatest production, but that I agreed with that one theme that came through of how some of these things are passed on from generation to generation. And I certainly see this in this group. Uncle was in jail, grandpa committed suicide. People don't like to hear this sort of thing. They say, don't you believe in free will? Don't you believe in the environment? Are you trying to say this is all in our genes? I'm not sure what I'm trying to say. I do believe in free will. I do believe in the environment's influence. But there's a lot of studies that are showing more and more some frightening things. For example, if you take an antisocial home, parents where you know one mother's in jail, maybe the father's in jail, and you adopt the child out, there's a very good chance that child will have troubles of the kind we're talking about, even if he's raised in a good home. And the other really impressive thing to me is you can take a person whose parents seem to be less tending toward antisocial activity, put him in a terrible home, and you know he doesn't do that bad. So there's some very good evidence that some of this stuff is in our blood, whether you like to hear it or not. Moving on to just kind of a mental examination of these people, a mental status exam. Most of them are not stupid. Some are bright, some are retarded, but most of them are fairly normal in intelligence, but they're undeveloped intelligence. More and more, however, I'm seeing a group of people who I consider formally insane. We call them schizophrenic, which means that they just don't think logically. They begin to think they're talking to God, that the devil tells them to do this, that people are calling them bad names under their breath. We're seeing more and more of this group because it's harder and harder to get people into mental hospitals. I don't know if you're aware of that. This is part of the civil rights revolution. And many, many times I have said to families, I'm sorry that we cannot help you get some help for little Johnny. He doesn't want to come out of his room. Just wait. We'll have to wait until things get so bad that he finally does come out of his room. And often he comes out of his room with an explosion. So more and more what we're seeing in the criminal justice system is people who really belong in mental hospitals. We can't get them there, so now they're in the criminal justice system. I'd say in the past few years I've been seeing 20 to 25% of the people who I interview who are accused of often a horrible crime are really truly crazy individuals. And the other group I would say I usually call them antisocial personalities, which simply means that they have a different value system than most of us, that they have a lifelong history of maladaptive behavior, and they just don't sweat the kind of things that most of us sweat. I think that's a quick composite of the kind of people that I've been seeing in the Portland area.
Thank you, Ed. We want to save as much time for questions as possible because I'm sure you all have some. But my experience with discussions of violence is that it's pretty depressing, and we'd each like to end up with some, on an upbeat note, if possible, talk about things we think can be done in this community and in our society to prevent violence. I took more than my fair share of time introducing the topic, so I won't say very much. I believe that violence is a learned behavior. I believe that as a mother. I believe that as a person who works in the criminal justice system. I believe that to the extent that it's learned, we can prevent it. We can work with children. We can have programs in our schools like the Child Development Specialist Program that increases a child's self-esteem, increases his ability to function in nonviolent ways. We can have parent effectiveness training programs for parents who are abusing their children so that they can become productive parents, not harmful parents. And to the extent that we can identify the characters that Ed just described, we can protect ourselves as a society from them by providing adequate prison space to incarcerate them. That's my solution. Vern, do you have some things you'd like to add to that?
One of the important things I think that we have to realize before we can talk about any kinds of solutions is that violence can be a relative term. We like to think of violent people as psychopathic personalities who are different than you or I. We are unwilling to charge people who are good, upstanding citizens of the community as violent when they do things like ship defective baby formula to South America. We don't want to think of those people as evil people. We want to think of those of them as people who made a mistake. So when we're talking about violence, I think we should be very, very careful in how we judge individuals and and in what context we are judging them. Like Mary Lou, I agree with her that violence is a learned behavior. I don't happen to believe that it's in our blood. I'm not going to discount that. I don't think the evidence is in. But it's learned behavior that is more likely to occur in certain social contexts. And those social contexts happen to be social contexts which include powerlessness, which include things like unemployment, minority status, little money. Powerless people, I think, show up in the statistics. They strike out because they've learned that that is a possible way to deal with their problems. But they strike out because there are some greater social pressures in the environment. One of the statistics in families shows us that the families where there is the least violence is in egalitarian families, which suggests to me that when people have a bit more power, they are less likely to engage in violence. If we could somehow spread the power around a bit more, that would be my solution.
Okay, Ed, you get the last say. What can you tell us about the causes and how to prevent it?
Simply, I've been appalled through the years at how tolerant as a society we are of violence. And it starts everywhere. Turn on the television. You've heard it all before, but watch Bonnie and Clyde tonight. It's a 4-star movie. It's the first 4-star they've had in weeks. What's Bonnie and Clyde all about? You know that. I mean, football games, kill them, tromp them, bomb Iran back into the Stone Age. You know, you've heard it, but it needs to be said over and over again, how tolerant as a society we are of violence. And I'll give you a quick interchange on a local level. You talk to a police officer, well, what happened? He said, well, he jumped on me and he wrestled me to the ground. This is a police officer. And he took my gun out and he tried to shoot me in the head with my own gun, but I was able to get my finger in the trigger to stop him from doing that. And we went to court. What happened? Well, he got a $50 fine or something like that. And I've heard this story over and over and over again. One of the judges has said to me, and it's not really a joke, that with burglars, for example, he thinks the greatest inconvenience he gives to them is the trouble they have trying to find a parking space around the courthouse on the day of their hearing. I think I would agree with what Justice Berger said, that we have to make it clear to people that violence just is not tolerated. We have to do something. That was wrong. That's not good. But before we do that, I think we have to get it off our TV screens and a whole lot of other things. That's all I say.
Thank you. It's your turn. Are there any questions for any of us today? Yes, sir.
There's a microphone in the center of the room, and we ask you please to state your name and, Mary Lou, identify the people in the audience. It's yours.
My name is Irvin Vargas. I'm a used car dealer in town. And I got affiliated with ex-county commissioner Mosey about 10 years ago, called the 7 Key Club. And ever since I hire people, not necessarily violent comers, and give them an opportunity to better themselves in life. I never had in the last 10 years one of them people either stealing from me, robbing me, or hurting me, and sometimes in the car business takes money I have thousands of dollars cash money in my pocket. We have to give them people an opportunity to be part of us. I don't want to put this party here to shame and say, how many people did you hire but been ex-comers? I don't think there's very many of us here. And I don't want to say I'm the right person, but maybe I can set an example on this part, where you take a person, most of your violent people have been in jail before this ever happened. And he comes out in a dirty pants and dirty shoes and dirty clothes, and he wants a job. First thing he has to tell the employer, I'm on probation. 99% will not hire him because he's on probation. That's not right. Man served his debt to society, should be treated equal. Give them people a chance. And I have another question for you, Doctor. Is it possible that the slightest remote, the food industry, with all the chemicals we eat, with all the garbage we get, is it possible that all this stuff we consume, but is not fit for human consumption, makes criminals, but people that are not quietly educated, like you and me, makes criminals easier because the chemicals they consume makes them violent. Is that possible?
Well, I
Think about it.
understand. I have to say yes, sir, it is possible.
And then we have to change it. It's that simple. We have to go back to organic food, and we have to give people food what is fit for human consumption.
My response would be there are a lot of people who are not violent.
Repeat the question.
What?
Please repeat the question, Mary Lou.
Okay, the question was, is one of the causes of violence the chemicals, the additives, the various ingredients added to our food, or other things that we ingest? Dr. Colbach said he thought so.
My response is that there are a lot of people who eat those things who are not violent.
Can we have another question, please?
I just said there are a lot of people who eat those things who are not violent.
Yeah, they're educated by the modern schools, etc. But there are
Right.
it's easier to do the wrong things.
Thank you. We're going to go to another question. Yes.
My name is Sandra Moore, and I'm a member of the club and also a member of the committee who studied this issue. And from what the committee learned and from talking to people like again, Sandra Moore, member of the club and member of the committee when we were studying this issue. And to quote my favorite psychologist, Tenny Hale, what is needed is a combination of support and restraint from what we found out. Community support, and also, as Mary Lou has said, we have to stand up as a community and say we aren't going to allow this to happen, just as we did with child abuse in 10 years ago or so. Another thing I'm concerned about are the people that are falling through the cracks.